I'm talking about homo genitus non factus, begotten, not made, the background of the German Embryo Protection Act and the stem cell discussion. It is today, ladies and gentlemen, 9 months before Christmas, that the Catholic Church celebrates the incarnation of Jesus Christ. This mystery is commemorated in the Credo by the words, et homo factus est, saying that the Word was made flesh, as St. John puts it. But there is another expression in the Credo about the question where Jesus Christ is stemming from. He is addressed as genitum non factum, in English, begotten, not made. This is claimed for Jesus Christ, but couldn't it, without any blasphemy, also be significant for all of us, the human beings, homo genitus non factus, begotten, not made? I dare say so. Factus, made, means produced in the way and with the methods of natural science, and referring to our body alone, seen only as a something which can be defined by time, number, measure, or weight. But genitus, begotten, means more. It refers to someone, or as usually said, to a person. It would take many lessons to describe and make understandable the relationship between our body and us, seen as persons, between something and someone. Therefore, we have to restrict our considerations to the question, how does the beginning of the person relate to the beginning of the body or the organism? This leads us directly into today's European discussion about embryo protection. The German embryo is overprotected. This was stated in the European Parliament in Brussels some years ago by an English scientist. He referred to the German embryo protection law from 1990, which, in the British view, bears too many restrictions for embryo research as well as for assisted procreation. Indeed, legislation on human embryos is much more liberal in Great Britain, where the embryo by definition comes into existence not earlier than 2 weeks after fecundation. Originally, this definition follows the terminology worldwide used by the anatomists. The etymology of embryo means that an implantation has been completed into the bryos, the Greek word for moss, thus meaning the mucosa of the uterus. But when the British physician Steptoe and his biologist Edwards were experimenting on extracorporeal fecundation of human egg cells, they did not follow the official terminology, but proudly called their results embryos. And also they spoke of embryo transfer into the uterus, in spite of the simple fact that at the time of transfer such an implantation had not yet occurred, cannot have occurred, and therefore there couldn't have been any embryo in the official meaning of the word. The British use, or better, the British misuse of the word embryo for those early human states was just a kind of laboratory slang and should not have any further meaning. But someday the British newspapers reported that Steptoe and Edwards were experimenting on human embryos. The press deplored sensationally that these poor embryos desperately tried to keep clinched to the glass walls of the test tube before they were put to death in the course of the research. British population was very much upset about such cruelties, and overnight the British Medical Council banned all British physicians which collaborated with Steptoe and Edwards. But again, overnight, Edwards invented a new word, pre-embryo, and claimed that nobody experimented on embryos, but only on these pre-embryos which were, as he said, no humans. Originally, it was a semantic error to call the early products of extracorporeal fecundation embryos, but later on it was a semantic trick to name them pre-embryos just in order to keep them outside of embryo protection. The British Warnock Committee followed this line in 1984 and allowed experimentation on so-called pre-embryos, as well as the production of more of them than necessary, surplus, as they called them, pre-embryos, thousands and thousands of which are kept deep frozen in England and in the United States as well. On this side of the ocean, the problem of the deep frozen surplus embryos had raised the famous case of Maryville in Tennessee in 1989, when a judge had to answer the question whether 7 deep frozen embryos of a couple in divorce were normal goods to be divided among the ex-husband and the ex-wife, or persons who need a procreator. It was in this famous Maryville case that the court acknowledged the embryos in the frost as human beings, but in 1992 this ruling was revised by the Tennessee Supreme Court and other courts here too, and meanwhile the British policy based on the pre-embryo concept is in common use here too. What is the medical background of this policy? Originally, there was some medical necessity to produce surplus embryos, but their pure existence additionally opened a broad field of medical and scientific possibilities for their use. These possibilities extend widely beyond the originally claimed necessities, and thereby they become by themselves not only an additional stimulus to produce surplus embryos, but they are even a justification for such surplus production. What was the originally claimed necessity? Be the chance of a woman to become pregnant by IVF, in vitro fertilization, about 20%, then in 4 of 5 cases the whole procedure has to be repeated. That means to start a new hormonal provocation for harvesting egg cells, to start again the harvesting itself, and so on. Normally one can get much more egg cells than necessary, but as a matter of fact, the surplus ones cannot be successfully used after deep freezing. The surplus egg cells cannot be used after deep freezing. However, if the egg cells were fertilized, that means if they became embryos, they tolerate deep freezing very well. Thus, it is in the best interest of the woman to produce all at once as many embryos as possible in order to keep them in stock for the next attempt of embryo transfer if the first one failed, and so on. But to do so does bear the risk that there remain deep frozen embryos after a successful transfer, resulting in a baby take home. This is the expression used as to characterize the maximum result of IVF, as there are results of a lower degree too, for instance, the mere successful fecundation, or, as often, an all too soon ending pregnancy. In any case, medical necessity, or at least medical usefulness, ask for the surplus production of embryos in the IVF procedure, but that inevitably puts up with the problem of remaining surplus embryos. Because of this problem, the fate of surplus embryos, the German Embryo Protection Act interdicted to fertilize more egg cells than embryos to be transferred all at once, and this means normally 2, or in exceptional cases, normally 3. It is absolutely clear that this legal restriction, the physicians lose true potentialities to minimize the burden of the woman and lose true potentialities to maximize the efficiency of IVF, that is, the baby take-home rate. In spite of knowing these circumstances very well, 12 years ago, the German parliament decided restrictively. The deputies believed the early embryo to be a human person, an end in itself, and therefore the deputies did not admit the embryo to be at the disposal for the benefit of others. This German legislation reflected the reminiscence of the reckless killing procedures in the time of the Nazis and clear determination to principiis obsta, to withstand any beginnings of a new regiment of death or of a culture of death, as John Paul II has put it. Nevertheless, the physicians engaged in assisted reproduction meanwhile increase the pressure on the parliament in order to liberalize the embryo protection law. New technical progresses in this field show that by observation of the cultured embryo for 5 days and by examining them with different methods, it would be possible to exclude from transfer those of them who do not or do less promise to grow up to take home babies. But for doing so, it would be necessary to have much more embryos at once and thereby produce much more surplus embryos too. But beyond these necessities and usefulness in favor of the mother and the efficiency of IVF, researchers demand human embryos for their aims, be they surplus ones or particularly produced for research. Research on early human embryos would not only show good promise for the progress of IVF, but much more for a better understanding of many severe diseases, and last not least, the embryos could be used as a source to produce embryonic stem cells, which are said to become a panacea, a sovereign remedy. This is not yet a fact, but a more promise. However, the mere fact that the embryo is killed by taking the material for the stem cells, so the stem cell promoters say, could easily be balanced against the profit for millions of future patients. And indeed, the profit is not impossible, but can much more be expected. However, the human society would have to pay for this profit by abandoning basic moral principles which not only stem from Christianity, but from Enlightenment as well. But most of the promoters deny such abandoning and claim, as the British do, the early embryo to be this pre-embryo and therefore not to be a human individual, not to be a person, and therefore not to be protected at all. But from an ethical point of view, one has to consider that the human being begins as a human being, and that means that it does not become a human being in the course of its growth. This, however, cannot be proven in the manner of biological science. From a biological view, there is human life in the human sperm, in the human egg cell, in the human embryo, as well as in the human fetus and the human newborn, even in his donated blood or organs and in cultures of human cells, be they stem cells or not. In a biological view, human life as represented in the human species, is a continuum of which we neither know its beginning thousands of years ago, nor its end, which we do not hope to occur too soon. Biologically, the human individual is nothing but, we speak of nothing butness of biology. Biologically, the human individual is nothing but some more concentrated being in the nearly eternal stream of human life. And as this some more concentrated being, the human individual is only more or less limited, is only a more or less limited event in this stream. It is impossible to define it as to its beginning or to its end purely by biological means. In other words, biology cannot tell us exactly when the human individual begins or ends. For this human being is more than biology. That means especially that it is connected with and in the possession of values, which cannot be put aside, and biology is and must be blind for values. This fact is a quite necessary characteristic of biology. Science has begun by excluding all opinions, beliefs, fears, and hopes, systematically restricting itself on what René Descartes had called res extensa. That means that the scientist has to restrain himself only on those things which can be measured, counted, or weighed, which means they have comparable extensions. But by virtually, hypothetically, and merely methodical excluding what Descartes called res cogitans, scientists want a stable foundation for scientific research. By this narrowed view of the world and man, however, which kept them on a strictly materialistic level, all those questions of opinions, beliefs, fears, and hopes were left open. For instance, the general question, why is there something at all and not merely nothing? Or the question, what am I for? And why do I suffer pain? These are no biological, but human questions. But these human questions are important for our policy dealing with humans. And therefore it is necessary to ask for the congruency if there is any, between man and the purely scientific view, and is in this more comprehensive view a most important question if we are urged to know when human being begins and also when it ends. However, the comprehensive view must be linked with, must be rooted in and based on objective significations, which can only be given by biology. One is tempted to try a simple projection from the person, viewed comprehensively, to the organism, viewed biologically. But projections are very difficult as long as both persons and organisms do not have the same dimensions but differ much more in this aspect. The difficulty can easily be understood in reflecting how somebody tries to draw an image of the three-dimensional surface of the terrestrial globe on a two-dimensional sheet of paper. This mapping must necessarily distort reality. All what can be done, as for instance Mercator did with his method of projection, is to minimize the errors stemming from this distortion. But there is never an exact copy of the three-dimensional surface of the terrestrial globe on our two-dimensional maps. It is much more impossible. It is the same problem when we try to make a projection of human being in a comprehensive sense down to the level of biological science. We can minimize the errors and try to overcome them, but we never get an exact congruency. However, I want to explain to you the most important three methods of this minimizing. One should reject the first one should prefer the second one, and at last one should be informed about the last one, the third one. The first method is relationism. Being aware that there cannot be a sure biological information about the question when a human being begins, the relationist says human is an animal sociale, and no human being can exist without social relations. Therefore, the human being begins with the beginning of social relations. The mild form of relationism says that the relation to the mother begins with the implantation in the uterus. But the more radical relationists say that social relations begin with a voluntary and conscient acceptance by someone, be it the mother or, as in the case of extracorporeal fecundation, the biologist or the physician. This opinion allows the physician the use of the embryo, not yet as a human being accepted, for whatever purposes, and allows abortion as it is in its mother's womb. This relationism, however, must be rejected, because at least since Enlightenment we believe a human being to have the right to live merely because of its pure existence and to be absolutely independent upon any acceptance by other people, and be it its mother. But most people do not understand that by following such relationism, they follow a real atavism and go back behind the Enlightenment. Once I have worked in a commission, in a European commission in Belgium, in Brussels. There was an Italian gynecologist who told me, if I have some cells in my petri schale, yeah, and I say this is these are some cells together, I can do with them what I want. And if I say this is a man, it is a man. This is this atavism. The second method to minimize the errors of projection uses the classical treatment, namely tutorism, admitting the fact that there cannot be an exact congruency between the comprehensive and the merely biologic view of the beginning of the human being. Tuturists search in biology for the moment of time before which there cannot have been a human being, cannot have been there an organism. Biology must answer, there cannot have been a new organism before the end of the fecundation process, and that means before the haploid state of life has changed into the diploid one, and before the new DNA exists in materia. Tutorism now tries to remain on the safer side. The Latin word tutor means safer. Safer in order not to hurt any right of an eventual human being. Tutorism says, as each and every human being must be highly respected, even in dubio, in case of doubt where one has to do with such a human being or not, one has to act as if it would be present. This is a so-called mixed judgment. Firstly, it refers to biology insofar biology states negatively that there is no organism before a certain moment. And secondly, the judgment is based on a positive human decision to respect human life far beyond any doubt whether it's already existing. When we therefore say that the life of the human individual, the life of the person, begins with the end of the fecundation process, we judge in a tutoristic manner. We decide to overcome any eventual errors about the beginning of the human being by keeping ourselves on the safer side. At a first glance, this tutoristic argumentation seems to be very weak and to lack urgency and persuasive power. As to its biologic part, it is only negative, not before. And as to its humanistic or moral part, it spells only with the hypothetic as if. But the strength and the power of this argument has to be found in the fact that it seems to be the best possible and the most simple answer to the question how far we have to respect and to protect human beings. One has to understand that it affords great moral strength and goodwill, but this is no argument against the tutoristic solution, as there is not to be sought a comfortable solution, but a solution which can stand firm, so to say, in splendore veritatis. But it must be admitted that the fight about the question beginning has become more and more exhausting and hair-splitting. Two very adverse German philosophers, Robert Spemann and Jürgen Habermas, recently raised the discussion to a higher level, avoiding any definitions about moments of the beginning. Spemann's claim reads, "A person is always a person," and thus seems to escape from the hic-hac of temporal moments. But for necessities of policy, he has to return to tutorism. Tutorism, however, by Spemann's claim, is much more powerful because his person is always a person, adds new dimensions to the problem. These new and wider dimensions are more elaborated by Jürgen Habermas, especially in his famous lecture, which he gave when he received last year the highly esteemed award of the German booksellers. Habermas asked whether at all the manipulations around passing on human life can be justified. Remember the Latin expression for passing on human life, meant to posterity. It is humanae vitae traditio. Now, beside that, Habermas states that among our people there is an effective resistance against the suspected alteration of what he calls identity of the species of man. But this resistance cannot only be understood as a merely effective one. The clear-headed contemporary German writer Hans Magnus Enzensberger recently attacked the fantasies about self-abolishing the human species. He diagnosed the biologic sciences to suffer of a maniac phase. This maniac phase would, Enzensberger says, provoke a public aggressive resistance. Composed with this resistance, the actions compared with this resistance, the actions of radical animal protectors would seem harmless, as because now there is no more trouble about some abstract risks, but about our own hide and hair, about our begetting, our origin, and our death, as far as Habermas. These thoughts and warnings from very different philosophers and writers do not stem from any usual and common fear of or animosity against technology, but they express a very sober analysis of what necessarily must follow the new aims of our biotechnology. The question is no more seen as to judging the means of technology, but now of judging their aims. Until now, these aims were only considered as far as their value could balance the value of life of an embryo or pre-embryo. The aims themselves, for instance, to fight disease or to further procreation, were believed as beyond any doubt. They left untouched man as man, human species as human species, and tried healing. But recently, our attention is drawn to more general aims, seemingly higher aims. Last, not least, the aim to produce a new species of man. There are some scientists who try to do so by integrating computers and nanocomputers combined with altered genes into human bodies, and there are others to try human betterment by eugenic measures, be they positive or negative. For instance, the German philosopher Sloterdijk believes all the methods of educating human beings to have failed, all culture to have failed, and claims to replace all epigenetic measures, in other words, to remake man by constructing a new and better genome. Sloterdijk pronounced his Regeln für den Menschenpark in analogy to Tierpark, the German word for zoological garden, and meant, if he could be understood at all, rules for the human zoo. His ideas were and are discussed in downright earnest and prove that there is not only the inner logic of biotechnical methods to end in such abstruse attempts for human betterment, but that there are thinking, planning, and active individuals to use biotechnics in this direction. We are confronted no more to mere fantasies, but much more with sturdy intentions. With Habermas therefore believes that the effective resistance against suspected alteration of the identity of the human species is not only rooted in a kind of blind affection, but has reasons which can be proven. He believes this resistance to be justified by an ethics of species. This word being a confrontation against Peter Singer, who criticizes the speciesism of the conservatives. The most important characteristics of these ethics of species are to respect natality, a term coined by Hannah Arendt, meaning that with each new human being there is put an initium, a new beginning, and this beginning could only realize in the world because the new individual himself has to have the ability for a new beginning, which would be impossible if it would be determined by others still before its coming into existence. Hans Jonas condemned cloning of human beings because the clones would be deprived of their originality, of their Ursprung, he said, and thereby deprived of their inborn freedom, their liberty in an as well objective as well as in a subjective meaning. What he said about clones can be said in an equal manner about human beings with an otherwise constructed or manipulated genetic program. Thus, the new discussion contains again general deliberations about passing on human life with astonishing, yet not expressed, consequences. More and more, one may see that the papal teaching about humane vitae traditio and donum vitae deals with today's problems in a much deeper way than originally was understood. Therefore, policymakers should no more search for temporal moments of beginning, but for the purity. It is the natural originality of the beginning of the human being, an originality which is heavily hurt by the modern methods of manipulating human procreation. Referring to this aspect, the former president of the German Forschungsgemeinschaft, a non-government organization for the promotion of research, Frühwald, called the recent discussion about pre-implantation diagnostics and the use of embryonic stem cells a Kulturkampf, which means a clash of cultures, but also reminds us of the fight of the German Chancellor Bismarck against the Church in the end of the 18th century. As fighters within this Kulturkampf, Frühwald identifies the purely scientific and scientistic culture on the one hand, and on the other hand, the humanistic culture. And Frühwald said, to enter this fight is worth for the future of mankind. In 1990, the members of the German Parliament released the so-called embryo protection law unanimously, by which any use of human embryos was interdicted for any other purposes than pregnancy of the woman, and even every totipotent cell was treated as an embryo. Today, a dozen years later, the majority of the same parliament wants to alter this law and liberalize policy in regard to embryos. Our members of parliament want to allow pre-implantation diagnostics, and even production and use of human embryos for research and therapy. The reason for this allowance is the fact that most of them have lost their confidence not only in the doctrine of the churches, but in the results of enlightenment too. And they are not yet informed enough about the new thinking about the identity of man as an individual and as species, not yet informed enough as to draw the necessary consequences for the future of mankind. Their resistance against these consequences is deep-rooted, I think, because of the similarity of the modern thinking to the papal doctrine against which they are prejudiced. Meanwhile, they are fighting for the import of human embryonic stem cells, which is not forbidden because of a lacuna in the law, but naturally forbidden according to the spirit of the law, as it was put in 1989. They do so instead of opening their eyes for the questions behind these troubles. Vidiant consules, the Romans used to say, which meant that their representatives should see. We still hope then that we can open their eyes. But at the moment, they are occupied in framing a bill about the import of embryonic stem cells. In some analogy to President Bush, they resolved 1.5 months ago to tolerate the import of embryonic stem cell lines, which were existing before a certain designated date. This could, in a way, be morally tolerated. But now, 6 weeks later, they try to trick themselves out of their own resolutions by using the word stem cells instead of stem cell lines. What for? If the stem cells, and not the stem cell lines, had to exist before a certain designated date, determined date, these stem cells could exist in frozen embryos, which are still living and not yet killed, with the consequence that President Bush's main condition is evaded, and this main condition was no further killing of embryos. These are the sad undergrowths of the Kulturkampf, of a clash of cultures, which has to be seen more clearly. Its issue is how to pass on the gift of human life to future generations. Rereading Humane Vitae, we understand separation of procreation from sexuality to be against human nature. Isolated procreation can be understood as the real root of all the dangerous and disastrous developments we fear and fight. A posteriori, we better understand what is meant by the untouchable union of procreation and sexuality. In this union, the identity of mankind is grounded. But if this be so, in reverse, the separation of sexuality from procreation is the same issue. And that means that we have to swallow a bitter pill in order to be prepared intellectually for the Kulturkampf between scientism and humanity. Thank you for your